Well, good morning, everyone. I see our participant list has just about reached our RSVP response, which gives us the cue that we're about ready to get ourselves started here. So welcome to Conner Prairie's annual meeting as we take a look back at 2021. We're thrilled to have you with us here. My name is Andrew Bradford. I'm the Vice President and Chief Advancement Officer for the museum. I'm so excited to be welcoming you today and to be serving as your MC through the next hour and a half of conversation. A few housekeeping rules. We do have everybody on mute at this point because we have quite a bit of information to present to you, but we would encourage you, as you have questions, to put those into the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that as we move ourselves along throughout the morning's conversation. And towards the end, as we wrap up our impact video and our keynote conversation with Laura Lott, we'll open up for a Q&A session where, again, raise your hands, you'll be unmuted, or utilize the chat feature to have a conversation. Again, we're so excited that you're here. We couldn't do the work that we do as a museum without the community and the staff and the volunteer leadership that we have on the board of directors. And so we hope that you enjoy this year's annual meeting as we get ourselves started. Norman Burns, President and CEO, take it away.
Andrew, thank you for laying the ground rules for this virtual annual meeting. And I want to welcome all of our attendees this morning to our virtual annual meeting that takes a look back at the past year of 2021 and looks at the impact that we've had on the community. As Andrew's already said, my name is Norman Burns. I'm President and CEO, and we're so happy to have each and every one of you here today. As we think about last year's annual meeting, which was virtual as well, we were looking back at 2020, and we really thought that this year we would be in a situation where we would be back to an in-person annual meeting with perhaps live streaming. And I think that's where we're going to be next year. But we continue to think about the health and safety of our guests and making sure that we're doing the right thing that's related to that. And when we had to make the decision on this annual meeting, it was months ago, and we were at a little bit different point in society at that point of where the Omicron variant was at. So we're back to virtual this year, but we're very happy to be doing that. I just want to give a huge shout out and a thanks to our staff, because the impact that you're going to see from 2021 could not have been done without their dedication and their passion to the mission of Conner Prairie. They're the true heroes of really making what we do so impactful to our community. And of course, our board for their leadership. Reggie Henderson is chair of our board of directors, and he's going to be saying a few words to you towards the end of the annual meeting. And of course, we have so many volunteers, both adult and youth and affinity groups that help raise money and awareness for Conner Prairie, as well as the many donors and members who support the work of Conner Prairie. You're all heroes as well. You're the ones who really make this a vibrant place. You have enabled us in 2021 to begin reimagining the future of our museum and what the future of museums in general is going to look like. That's why we invited Laura Lott, who's the president and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums, to be our keynote speaker today and to actually answer some questions for you during our live Q&A session. So we're really looking forward to that and really talking more about how we're changing the way the world views and uses museums. We chose today as our annual meeting date, April 1st, for a specific reason. And I think we're going to have a new image come up on the screen at this point. Today happens to be the 137th birthday of Eli Lilly. So we wanted to say happy birthday to Eli Lilly. And at this time, I'm going to get out of my virtual background, because if you'll notice, beside me is a birthday cake. Do you see it sitting there? Well, I'm going to actually give you a little bit closer look at this birthday cake. Our staff decided to make Eli Lilly a birthday cake. And so we could celebrate it with all of our members today at the annual meeting. So I wish I could share this delicious cake with each and every one of you, but you just have to trust me. I'm going to take a bite of it on your behalf, if you don't mind. And we'll all wish Eli Lilly a happy birthday. Isn't he beautiful? Look at that. Wonderful colors. Oh, that's not what I was expecting. Just remember, this is April 1st, isn't it? April Fool's Day. So A little inside story about Eli Lilly and his grandchildren. Because his birthday was on April 1st, they would always make a birthday cake out of toothpaste as an April Fool's kind of prank for him. And I think the staff has done the same thing today in order to remember Eli Lilly. So I tell you what, I've had my toothpaste this morning. Maybe I need to go floss now, but while I'm kind of composing myself, we'll continue to say happy birthday to Eli Lilly. And now we want to take a look back at 2021 and the impact that we've made. And we want you to see how we begin to reimagine how museums work. We'll see you in a few minutes.
In many cases, a lot of other museums are a lot more formal. They feel a lot more exclusive.
But I feel like here, everything is noisy and exciting. And that offers that experience for both kids and adults alike to just be them.
We're not stagnant. You're in an outdoor environment. You're breathing fresh air. Basically tell you a museum can be fun. It doesn't have to be, you know, just stagnant and dull. Learning can be fun.
So at Conner Prairie, our values as an organization is that we have a heart for the past, a head for the present, and an eye to the future. And I really think our staff, each and every day, they look at making those meaningful connections in the community here on site. 2020 particularly, as we began to face both health and societal issues, we really had to rethink the way that we do our business and the way we reposition ourselves. We have to be a community asset. One of the ways we've done that is through our diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion promise statement, where the doors are always open to a diversity of voices and limitless experiences. And I'm just very proud of the way our staff is always analyzing things. We're an entrepreneurial organization. We're always finding opportunities and change, and that's why we've been successful and actually be more relevant to the community. And I really think that's how we exhibit our values of that heart for the past and head for the present and eye to the future.
My name is Sarah Withrow. I'm very much a part of the Textile Studio and the Loom House. Reimagining here at Conner Prairie for the past year and a half, almost 2 years, has been a little different, a little interesting. In the past, we've always been so much involved with hands-on, be a part of, touch and feel, and give me your thoughts. But this year, with respect for COVID and the distance that we needed to follow, we needed to find other ways to do that. For my part, as a demonstrator, it was more verbal description, being as detailed as I could, but also making comparisons and contrasts. To be a part of the story, I think, is a big part of our story. Have guests be involved in what's going on.
My name is Shantae Gaston. I'm a senior interpreter here. Sometimes you'll see me out here in the grounds, in costume, playing the characters, doing programs. Conner Prairie is set up to be able to give people a unique museum experience. You walk out into the grounds and you are in a Civil War, or you're in Prairie Town, you're in Lenape. So you get to talk to people and see the costumes and see people walking around in the costumes. So we are presenting history and trying to teach people in an immersive way. What our present looks like is not exactly what our past looked like, especially when we're talking about, say, accessibility. We wouldn't have ramps on these buildings in 1836, but today we should. So we're merging kind of two worlds so that we can fit today's present, because we want to make sure that everyone can experience this, but in a comfortable way.
My name is Dwight Gallia. What we do here in the trades department, we just don't pretend to be blacksmiths, we are blacksmiths. What we do here is we teach the history. I see the story in my mind when I'm telling it. And when I tell one, I want to be able to do that to my audience too. I want them to be able, through my words, to actually visualize. I want to paint a picture in words. When I came here, things were different. What changed from there to now was, instead of trying to get across a certain story or part of history, we want to see what your interests are. When you say something to me, and I can tell by the way that you look or gesture or something that that's something that interests you very much, that's more important. We're going to follow your interests. We're going to see where that leads, where that follows, what you want to know.
I'm Brandy Zolman. I'm the Director of Education. Once I started here, I was given the opportunity to study learning in a different way. The philosophy that we created allowed children to guide the learning, puts the focus on the learner, and asks the facilitator of that learning to be interested in the person in front of them. And when we do that, it becomes an experience that is far beyond what the guests expected when they came here. It goes beyond the content, beyond the learning even, and becomes an interaction between two humans who find common ground. Those are the moments that I believe are magical and that I believe make people want to come back.
My name is Rachel Sego. Started off as an interpreter. I transitioned into the indoor experience coordinator, which is in charge of everything from Discovery Station to Create Connect. Whenever I started here, Craft Corner had very dedicated crafts where the kids were like, make a pumpkin, make a whatever. Slowly over time, we have transitioned more into this, why have these dedicated crafts? It's way more interesting to see the really cool things that kids can create when you just give them supplies. Honestly, it's been magic to watch in here. The linger time of guests in this space has gone from like the 5-minute little craft that kids would do to I've seen guests stay in here for over an hour working on things. I really think learning needs to be an individualized experience. Some people learn by just sitting back and watching. Some people learn by having an actual conversation with you. Some people learn by tinkering. Giving people the space to do all of those things is very important, and I think we're well on our way to making that happen for everyone.
If we want to change the way people view and use museums, it starts with the humans that work here. It starts in our hearts and in our heads. We are only able to acknowledge the stories that we've already heard, appreciate what's come before, but also acknowledge what was missing from the stories that we've been told or taught. And so the staff is committed to remembering the stories that maybe we weren't telling.
I'm Reggie Henderson. I'm chairman of the board of Conner Prairie. In the past, Conner Prairie was focused basically on the European story. Now we're seeing a very welcome inclusion of other stories as well. And as a result, that also just sort of shows the ability to grow, to expand the story, to expand the mission, and to do so in such a way that the story doesn't become old, it doesn't become staid, and it doesn't become stagnant. History, of course, is something that continues. It grows, so the story from 1830 to 1999 is a lot different than it is now from 1830 to 2022.
My name is Dr. Charlene Fletcher, and I am the curatorial director here at Conner Prairie. My department is tasked with ensuring that all historical research is taken care of, done properly, accurately across the institution. We're standing in the vault right now. We have more than 20,000 objects just in our collection alone, but a lot of those objects do not speak to the experiences of Hoosiers of color. And so as we diversify, we have a staff that is taking serious interest and care in sharing these stories through not only storytelling on the grounds, visitor interaction, but also being able to understand the new objects that will become part of Conner Prairie's permanent collection. We will celebrate the opening of our newest exhibition, Promised Land is Proving Ground, this year in 2022, which delivers the story of African American history. Conner Prairie needs to move forward in a new direction to ensure that everyone that comes here feels welcome, but also that everyone that comes here can not only see themselves, but learn about that history and how we interact and how we shape our communities so that we can move forward.
I think as I think back over the last 2 years, it's tough. It's been tough on everyone. But I'm just so pleased at the way we were able to plan and pivot. I think that's where the creativity of our staff, my colleagues here at Conner Prairie, a lot of people kind of go inward during a crisis situation. I feel like Conner Prairie, that our staff and as an organization, we begin to look at ourselves outward. Just because it's a crisis doesn't mean we can't serve. Just because it's a crisis doesn't mean we have to set our obligations aside. And that's really what I'm most proud of is how my colleagues, both on staff and our board, how we made commitments to this community and were able to do things that a lot of organizations weren't able to do.
I hope you all felt and heard the mission of Conner Prairie come through in that impact video with our staff, that we continued to reimagine our future, but to focus on how we could inspire curiosity and foster learning each and every day through individualized experiences for everyone. We're proud of what the future is going to hold for Conner Prairie, and we're excited about all of the support from the community that's coming forward to help us achieve these visions that we have to reimagine and redefine how the world views and uses museums. At this point, it's my pleasure to virtually introduce our keynote conversation. As Norman mentioned at the beginning of our annual meeting, of course, hindsight being 2020, we would have loved to have had this in person, but with the months of planning it takes to put this together, COVID-19 simply wouldn't have allowed it. We're proud, though, that Laura Lott, President and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums, is able to join us today virtually, and will join us live for Q&A at the end of the annual meeting. The American Alliance of Museums represents the entire scope of the museum community, and Laura is the first female to lead the organization. She joined in 2015 and has since led many of the efforts to think about financial sustainability, think about accessibility for museums across the country, and to lead the organization in redesigning its programs to grow, to help museums across the country grow. We joined her for this conversation and asked her to reflect on what it means to reimagine the future, to redefine how the world views and uses museums. We asked her to think about this on the micro scale of Conner Prairie, and then we asked her to provide insights for us on the macro scale as it relates to museums across the country. And so it's my pleasure now to bring you a conversation between Norman Burns, President and CEO of Conner Prairie, and Laura Lott, President and CEO of the American Alliance of Museums. We hope you enjoy, and we'll see you at the end of the keynote conversation.
Our theme today is reimagining our future. And of course, that's about Conner Prairie, but that's also about, I think, the museum community, and not just in North America, but worldwide. Conner Prairie has an aspirational goal to change the way the world views and uses museums. And I think AAM and a lot of your accredited museums are doing the same thing, whether they would be art museums or botanical gardens or science centers or children's museums or history museums like Conner Prairie. I think there's many of us which said, we have a different role in the community. And I see that playing out in your strategic plan. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We, during the last couple of years in particular, have seen a rapid acceleration of many trends, right, in our society. And of course, museums as a microcosm of societies at large have been seeing them themselves. And we've seen some glaring inequities in our country that have been there all along, of course, but became sort of painfully clear to many more people over the last couple of years. When the pandemic started in 2020, one of our museum directors said, the museums we're closing will not be the same museums that we reopen. And I still think about that every day, because what a, just on point comment from that director. And, again, with my financial background, I do think, you never waste a good crisis.
That's right.
There's been so much, pain and suffering by so many of these last couple of years. And I've been saying since the pandemic started, we in the field have to really use this disruption to rethink some things that really weren't serving us well even prior to 2020, but maybe we weren't as pressed to address. And so I think the reimagining of our museums is still very much underway, but I'd summarize it perhaps as museums being a little less authoritative and a little bit more collaborative with their communities. So we launched, as you said, just in December, knowing that the American Alliance of Museums is I think a point of inspiration for many institutions and a point of change and leadership in the country. And so as we're coming out of I hope the worst parts of the pandemic, we wanted to be out ahead of some of the changes that we see happening in the field, and launched our new strategic plan a couple of months ago. Really inspired by what museums have been doing. Museums have stepped up in amazing ways to serve their communities these last few years in particular. Some museums have been doing that all along, and we saw that those were some of the museums that really weathered some of the challenges of the pandemic better than others that hadn't been as embedded in their communities. And some museums, really found that power of being embedded in their communities for the first time, or at least much more strongly in the ways that they were addressing community needs. And so we ran with that with our strategic plan. And one of our priorities is, social and community impact. We've long known at AAM that museums can change the world. That's, part of our vision statement as well. And that they have essential roles, not just nice to have, but essential roles in sustaining, strong and inclusive and resilient communities, whether that's by enriching the education system or bolstering economies, which we don't think about with museums very often, but that indeed is part of our value, or just strengthening the social fabric of communities, which we've seen, I think, in the last couple of years have been, divided in all sorts of ways. But museums really can do I think a better job of telling that story, of measuring that real impact. And so that's driven a lot of our new strategic plan is really about, social and community impact. How do we measure not just reach, not just how many folks come through our museums, but really why does it matter? Because we know that it does, and we want to help museums make that case.
With this strategic plan, and I know that it's for every museum, but of course we've already mentioned that the American Alliance of Museums is the accrediting body for our profession. And Conner Prairie has been an AAM accredited museum since 1977. And as a matter of fact, we're in the process of our fourth reaccreditation right now. And as you look at museums like the accredited museums, which I think represent less than 4% of all museums in our profession currently, what do you see their roles? What's the role of Conner Prairie as an accredited museum in this kind of this new strategic plan of yours, and this idea that we're reimagining the future, not only for Conner Prairie, but for all museums?
Conner Prairie is one of the thought leaders in our field that we have the honor really of sharing Conner Prairie's work with our field through our magazine, through our website, through our annual meeting. We now host the largest annual meeting of museum professionals in the world each spring. And Norman, I've appreciated your leadership on our content advisory committee, selecting the topics that are most of interest and most of need in our field. And Conner Prairie plays a really important role, as an exemplar, not just with AAM, but a Smithsonian affiliate. I know, you've been in IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services is the agency here in Washington that also gives awards every year for exemplary institutions, and Conner Prairie has received those in the past. And we have many shared goals, which is not an accident. It's this conversation between AAM and exemplary institutions like Conner Prairie that has resulted in our social and community impact goal. That's very similar to your strategic framework plan around changing the way the world views and uses museums. So on point. Again, what we saw during the pandemic is folks were very concerned about local businesses and restaurants and shops, and weren't as concerned about museums at the beginning. I think because there's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what museums do, and of course how they stay open. It's of course through our communities that we're existing. And I know we have shared goals in our, DEAI, what we call DEAI, diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work, very represented through Conner Prairie's promise statement, right? To be a place where the doors are always open to a diversity of voices and limitless experiences. It's so well put, and we share those and many other goals.
You mentioned earlier about that one crisis is a bad thing to waste, and I agree with you on that. I'm a huge proponent as kind of an entrepreneurial leader that there's always opportunity and change. And probably the greatest social and health crisis that we faced was the year 2020 through the COVID pandemic, and of course the things that transpired with social injustices in our country that really elevated things that we're looking at. But COVID-19 in particular really, in some ways, set museums back, but also set us on a new course. And I think many of us use what would be called the survive, and then plan to thrive mode. We survived and then learned how to provide differently, and then plan to thrive. And it then led us into very similar what you said about another director that you talked to. In 2021, we created a thematic goal that we realized that all the changes that we had made during COVID to our buildings, to our policies, to how we served our guests, it's not like we were going to go back to business as usual. It's not like all of a sudden we were going to change back to the way we used to do business. So we started thinking about it as the business of the unusual. What are the things that we can do that's unusual, that's now our new business? And that's kind of the model that we've carried over into 2022. So my question to you is, I've kind of explained some of the things that Conner Prairie has been doing, but where do you see the field coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic? How do you see us evolving with your strategic plan, and what's the future for museums coming out of COVID-19?
I love your comment about business is unusual. I think that's a perfect descriptor for what many institutions are going through. Again, museums aren't just about artifacts or places. They're about people. I often say, museums don't just hold artifacts, we hold them up and we tell the stories behind them, the stories of people, right? And I think that the field and our audiences realize that more than ever, unfortunately, when people couldn't visit, because of quarantines, most museums, on average, museums were shut down for 28 weeks over the last 2 years, many much longer than that. Some were, outside and able to open sooner. But virtually all museums stepped up and served communities in new ways and served people in their communities in new ways, whether it was donating PPE at the beginning of the pandemic to, growing food in their gardens for food banks and feeding folks who are hungry, to delivering virtual programming that either, helped to bolster the education system, which was really struggling, right, when schools had to close, to just helping people break out of the isolation and the mental health challenges that, we've all dealt with over the last couple of years. So, they did all of that despite pretty difficult financial circumstances for many. At the beginning of the pandemic, some of our data showed that 1/3 of museums might go out of business if the pandemic continued, because again, they're reliant on people for tickets and other things too, right, for some of their business models. And I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes in our country where folks assume that museums are supported by the government in great extent or by a couple of wealthy donors, but they're by and large not. They're supported by communities, and every ticket sale, every dollar in the donation box, every purchase in a gift shop, it all contributes to these institutions continuing to be strong. We were pleased through the Alliance's work, following our strategic plan, focus on advocacy and making the case for museums here in Washington and elsewhere, to secure about $3 billion in relief funding for museums across the country. Yeah, and I don't get to talk about billions of dollars of funding for museums very often, but
no, you don't.
This was unprecedented show of support, really, from leaders in our country who recognized the value of museums and the need to make sure that they survived through some of the most challenging financial times we've ever experienced as a field. And so we know that relief funding and some of the other funding that came from philanthropists and community members who shared the same values, saved thousands of museums, literally thousands of museums. There's something like 30,000 museums in our country. About half of those are history oriented. And we also know that when museums close, they tend not to come back, right? So we need to, we needed to make sure that these places continue to exist to tell the stories of our history, to build the pride, in our country, and also to build some understanding and context for why we're dealing with some of the things that we're dealing with as a society because of what's happened in the past. And so, the lasting impacts, I think, of the pandemic are things like, accelerated technology use. Museums found whole new audiences doing many programs virtually and thinking about that, business of the unusual and innovating in new ways. So, kind of serving community needs beyond that traditional museum role, and really integrating into community infrastructure, being part of the school system, part of the healthcare system, mental health system, part of environment and conservation, needs in our communities. Our new Trends Watch report it's an annual forecasting report done by a futurist that we have on staff at the Center for the Future of Museums, which is part of the Alliance. The report just came out, and it makes the case that museums are vital to that public infrastructure by virtue of their contributions to 5 pillars of community strength and resilience, such as education and livable communities for our elders. We know we have a growing aging population that also is staying healthier longer and wants to be active and contribute and continue to learn. And museums are thinking about their education work, not just for children, which is very important, but also lifelong learning, I think, in new ways, and really thinking about the growing demographic that is our elders. And, knowing that we are on the verge, maybe we're in the middle of a pretty big mental health crisis following on everything that's happened the last couple of years. Museums are and can be huge community infrastructure support in that crisis, really, as well. And so the Trends Watch report focuses on things like that, and has in the past also talked about the tremendous trust that people have in museums, and how that is in a time where there's pretty much rampant distrust in every institution. People trust museums second only to their friends and family in terms of sources of information. It's a huge power. It's also a huge responsibility for us. And so there's lots of great, I think, ways that we can continue to just, accelerate this change that's happening in our industry, in our communities, as we go into the new normal times, the business of the unusual times. One of the things I think we're all realizing too is this rapid acceleration of change that's occurred in the last couple of years probably isn't going away. There's probably, going to continue to be a need to constantly scan sort of what's happening out there, and do almost ongoing strategic foresight, ongoing strategic planning, to capture the opportunities, to meet the needs. And, on the education front, there's a lot of conversation that the last couple of years has really and permanently changed, our education system. We saw more children going to school at museums the last 2 years than ever before, because again, museums, many of them open their doors to, students of, first responders or others who had to go to work but still needed a place for their children to do virtual school during the day. And I think we don't go back from that. I think once we realize the power of that opportunity beyond the field trip, there's no going back. And I think that's, those are good outcomes from a pretty dark, difficult time, because museums, again, stepped up to address community needs and innovated in new ways. I think it's one of the most powerful roles that museums have, and way beyond the field trip, the traditional field trip we've thought about as museums' contribution to education before. I think there's a greater recognition of the value of, in this digital world, in this virtual world, the power of the real thing, the real place, the real people, the real experiences that museums offer. And I think as education, the formal education system rethinks itself, I hope museums can be positioned as part of that, that community infrastructure. Students may still go to school buildings to learn, but also they go to the library to learn, they go to the museum to learn, they go to these other, places in our communities that have things to offer. And I think, a couple of years ago, our Center for the Future of Museums also did a big report on the future of education and predicted only the expansion of the divide between the haves and have-nots in the education system as it's currently configured, and made the case that museums have a role in helping to address that and level more of a level playing field for all of our students and communities, regardless of which school they happen to go to and which neighborhood they live in, but providing enriched opportunities for all students. And so I think education is another industry that changes slowly, but I think it's changing, and museums are well positioned to be part of the solution, which I think will have tremendous benefits to our students and our society going forward. Kudos to Conner Prairie once again for leading much of that work. And also for leveraging the power of our museum community as another component of our strategic plan is bringing together museums of all different types and sizes, and everybody can't be the best at everything, right? And so there's always something to learn from what another institution is doing, and so we are, with our new strategic framework, doubling down on that role to convene and celebrate the best of what's happening across the field, and help museums sort of find those gems of programs and approaches that might be translatable, and the people too. We've got some really wonderful talent like yourself, Norman, and other institutions across the field to learn from. And so we're really again doubling down on bringing that community together and making sure that we're providing lots of opportunities for the art museums to learn what the zoos are doing, and the the history museums to teach the children's museums, and vice versa. So it's such a rich community.
One of the things that I've been speaking to quite a bit, especially since I've been at Conner Prairie, but I'm a true believer that museums are a community asset. And I think when people think of a museum, they usually think of it in a singular form. Oh, that's an art museum, or that's a history museum, or that's a botanical garden, or a science museum, or a children's museum. And what people don't realize is we're community assets. In the case of Conner Prairie, we may be a first-person living history site, but we're an experiential site. And we're actually a general museum by AAM standards, because we teach 2 or more disciplines. So we're much more than just a history museum. And you can say the same thing for art. You can say the same thing for any museum. And I think what we've learned, or what museums are continuing to learn, is what our role in the community is. And in the past, perhaps museums, we've tended to educate as museum educators. So we know how to develop programs, and maybe it's almost been after the fact that we said, we really ought to partner with someone in the community on this. And I think Conner Prairie now, and I think a lot of museums are beginning to say, you know what, we have a heart for this work, but we're not the content expert. We want to listen to what your needs are to a particular organization or another site in a community, and say, so what can we do to join you? What can we do to help? And I think that's probably led to some of our best partnerships at Conner Prairie in the last 6 or 7 years. And I think a lot of museums are doing that now. I think they were doing it before the pandemic. And I don't want to say the pandemic has forced us into greater partnerships, but as you said, a crisis is a bad thing to waste. And I think it's causing not only museums, but performing arts organizations across our cultural arts sector. And you speak to, when we're doing museum advocacy in Washington, you always have some great graphics about the economic impact of our cultural arts sector, which is greater than all the professional sports combined. And a lot of people don't realize what the impact is. So that's part of your leadership. You want to speak a little bit more to that? I kind of opened the door on that one, but I mean, I think this community, the way we work with our communities is only going to give us a greater economic impact and a social healing aspect, I think, of what we do.
I think, as we, as a country and as communities sort of, make our way through this challenging time, I think we have to use all of the assets at our disposal in our communities, right? And museums certainly are one. And I think both museums and our communities are realizing that more and more. On the economic impact, you're right. We don't like in the field to talk much about our economic impact because, of course, museums are priceless, so we don't want to put a price tag on them. But I was surprised when we did a 2017 economic impact report, the first one that had ever really been done just for the museum field with the Mellon Foundation and Oxford Economics. And we learned that the economic impact of the museum field on the country's GDP is $50 billion a year. Nothing to sneeze at, a significant impact. And more than the number even, I think, was the making the point that museums don't just take, right, in the form of government funds or other funds, but we give back economically as well as many other ways. That was an enormous realization, and I think led to some of the openness to helping museums during this last couple of years, because our legislators knew that it would pay off for communities big and small all across the country where museums are located. And one of the other statistics that I think is just fascinating is even though most of our museums are nonprofits, they contribute $12 billion annually to taxes, federal, state, and local taxes. So, which is multiple fold, the amount of money that we tend to get from the government. So we are economic engines, in addition to vital, I think, education institutions and community assets in a variety of ways.
And we're a large sector. If I'm not mistaken in that report, I don't remember the two above us, but I think we're the third. If we put us all together, we're the third largest sector. And that's amazing. I don't think people think of museums and cultural arts organizations as being this huge sector that has the type of economic impact. I mean, Conner Prairie alone, we have a $50 million economic impact on our local communities. Because a lot of people don't think about this. We employ over 400 people, both full-time, right, part-time, seasonal, and we contribute, as you said, to not only hiring practices, but we hire people to do contracting work, and we receive grants. Money goes back out in the community and things that we're doing, and serving over 400,000 people annually, whether it's school groups or general admissions or special events. Those are all people that are putting money back into the economy, and that's what museums do at their best. As we are these community assets that are bringing people together. We can have this dialogue, but we can also help the economy. And once again, I think that's something we don't talk about enough as a museum profession. So I've always been happy when AAM or even the organization that I'm the chair of now, American Association for State and Local History, when we start talking about how our sector can really be impactful on the communities that we serve. One of the things, I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, I think one of the things that AAM did back in 2017 that was really groundbreaking was a study that you did called Facing Change. I think it was a 6-month study that led to the Facing Change document. And I'll never forget being in the CEO forum that particular year where you introduced that and said, the article, the report's coming out this fall. We want you to go back to your museums, CEOs, and we want you to embrace this and do something with it. And I heard what you said, went back, we immediately put together an internal group and we started working on that, which led to the creation of our diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion promise statement that you mentioned, that Conner Prairie is going to be a place where the doors are open to a diversity of voices and limitless experiences, but it put together an action plan. And that's all from the AAM Facing Change document, and then your strategic plan, and then your new strategic plan. So tell me a little bit more about this Facing Change and how that has really begun to not only help AAM redefine its direction, but because you're our accrediting body and the largest museum organization in the world, how it's changing all museums.
Yeah, no, thanks, Norman. I love hearing stories like that. This is, I think, some of the most important work of our time, to really think about how museums can be more equitable institutions for ourselves, and help to create more equity in our communities as well, since we have such an impact in a variety of ways on those communities. So the Facing Change report was really a working group of people from across the sector who were asked, why have we not in the field made more progress? There was some data that came out with specifically about art museums around the lack of racial and ethnic diversity at the leadership of many of our institutions. And then there was a second study that AAM led around boards that showed us that 49% of museum boards were 100% white, right? So no people of color represented at the leadership levels. And some other data that pointed to just I think a general sort of racial and ethnic makeup that represented America in the 1970s.
Such a polarized nation today, and there's certain words like anti-racism and like even diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. I mean, there's some would say, well, why can't we just talk about equality? And so there's a lot of things out there that I think organizations like AAM, American Association for State and Local History, we had our board meeting yesterday, and we were having this conversation about what role should we play in positioning so museums can better communicate and talk to the public about why this is important, because it's so polarized. So how do you see AAM? How do you see your organization helping museums like Conner Prairie, helping us communicate better and correctly to our constituencies, to our donors, and helping them better understand how we need to continue to evolve as a society to make sure that the term that they're using, equality, involves all of the things that we're talking about, because there's a big difference between just equality and equity and the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and thanks for the chance to take a stab at it. I think work that AASLH is doing on reframing history is really great work to help our field understand the why and how to communicate the why to our boards, to our visitors, to all of our constituents. But I think we have to acknowledge as a field that many of our structures, many of our museums are built on on a colonialist, largely white male driven structure, and we can't just sort of move on from that. We really have to grapple with that in order to figure out how to move on from that together, as including more of our communities in the work that we do. There shouldn't be, I think our DEAI work should be about helping people become more curious about why we are where we are, what some of the origins of the conversation, some of the disputes, some of the words, some of the distinctions between the words that we use, become curious about why those exist, and then that opens the door to actually learning and changing perspectives. So this is hard work because it's personal to every individual, and it's culture change, at an institution or in a community. And so it's necessarily going to take some time, and it's going to be a little bit of a struggle, but it's also joyful. I mean, I think the institutions that have welcomed different parts of the community into their institutions more readily over the last couple of years, or gone out into the community, which is happening a lot too, to different parts of the community, beyond the, you're a living history museum, so you do this all the time, but beyond the four walls of a museum, to going out into the community, are learning and experiencing wonderful new things, joyful things. There's a lot of, our country has always been built on the premise that we're a melting pot, that there's joy, that there's strength in pulling together and welcoming people from all different backgrounds, people who look different, who have different celebrations, who who have different perspectives. And this is sort of the current really living into that value that our communities and our museums are working with. And I think our museums can help lead again in our communities, because they are one of the last places where communities really can come together and have a joint experience and have a conversation about something that, you know, an object or a story of history, you know, based in fact, based in original sources, primary sources, can have discussions. And I think that we have an important role to play in bridging some of the really challenging divides in our communities.
You talked about curiosity. Of course, that's one of the things that we have in our mission statement, that we inspire curiosity and foster learning. You know, there's a show on, I guess, Apple TV called Ted Lasso, and I think a lot of people have probably watched Ted Lasso, and he really repopularized that quote, "Be curious, not judgmental." And you know, that's a very powerful statement that's being made. Tell me the role of museums as this community dialogue place. Where do you see that? Because that's a big part of what I think a big part of what your strategic plan is. Tell me how museums, and tell me how you think Conner Prairie. I want your advice. What's Conner Prairie's role in that in the next few years?
Yeah, I think there's some great examples out there that are starting small in some cases of really facilitating difficult conversations, right? So that's largely what history is about, or you know, could be about. And so building up a capacity to facilitate difficult conversations with various members of our communities, and actually hosting them as, you know, events and programming at our institutions, I think is one of the ways that I'm starting to see museums really step up to do. And so it will be interesting to see what you know, if we can measure the impacts of that on a community over time, that there are more folks who, you know, we've forgotten as a people, I think, how to have respectful dialogue, how to, you know, disagree with each other respectfully, how to listen before we decide what our position is. I think our, you know, social media and our 24/7, you know, news cycle has led to some of this polarization and our ability to kind of go into corners and have our worldview just reinforced by the people who agree with us. And it's too easy to shut off anything that you know, that doesn't reinforce our worldview, or that, you know, disagrees with us. And so there's a need to help people relearn those skills of, you know, dialogue and listening, active listening, you mentioned, and how to be curious, not judgmental. And I think museums can do that through their exhibitions, through their programs, through modeling, you know, our own behaviors as institutions. So some of this work really needs to be done internally, as well as, you know, with our audiences. And I think we're going to see a lot of creativity, as we've seen museums step up in other ways, a lot of creativity in this realm as well, because it's vital.
I've asked you a lot of questions, and you've asked me a few, but are there any other questions that you might have for me as one of your accredited museums, and that you'd like our audience to hear?
Yeah, well, I did want to, you know, the changes we've been talking about are evolving the field's, you know, standards and best practices. They're not static, you know, standards, right? And we talked about the conversation between institutions and the Alliance to continue to evolve what it means to be excellent in our field. And so, you know, the diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work, and this, you know, social and community impact work we've been talking about is being incorporated into accreditation, which I know, you know, Conner Prairie is now pursuing, and getting accredited or reaccredited is a lot of work. So I wanted to just ask you, why do you do it, Norman? What does accreditation mean to Conner Prairie and to its community?
Well, accreditation is, I know it gets overused, but it's like that gold standard. I mean, you mentioned that Conner Prairie was, when we first were accredited in 1977, it was the beginning of the program, and now we're in fourth reaccreditation. I think that's why Conner Prairie has evolved to be such an innovative museum, and one that is really seen, especially in the history museum side, is really seen as one of those top achievers. And people have looked to us and the type of programming and things that we've done. And I can point to accreditation and reaccreditation being the reason that Conner Prairie has been that since 1977, because it forces you to look at these best practices and be a continuous learner in what you're doing. So every time you go through reaccreditation, you do this self-study, and it asks hard questions about, are you doing this? And based upon where the profession is at any given time, AEM changes what those questions are and what you need to be doing as an accredited museum. So you continue to get better and you continue to strive. And so for me, it's almost like that goal of trying to get to the mountaintop, but I'm not sure that we're ever going to be quite there, but we get closer and closer. And so we know that that's our goal, is to get there. And I don't think Conner Prairie, if accreditation is around a century from now, and we've been at that point, reaccredited 12 times, I don't know that we'll be to the mountaintop looking over everything at that point. We're still going to be striving. And I think that's what's significant about an accreditation program, or even with AASLH, we have a STEPS program, which is a very modified version of that for smaller museums. It allows us to evaluate what we're doing and make changes and be better. And if we're doing that as a singular museum for the profession, that means that our audiences are being impacted in a very positive way. So it actually has a great impact on providing better programs, exhibits, services to all of our constituents, whether it be a Conner Prairie or any museum that's out there. So that's why we do it. That's why Conner Prairie does it. That's why I enjoy being one of your peer reviewers for accreditation and for the MAP program, because I learned so much and I bring it back to Conner Prairie all the time.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And, of course, by being an accredited museum and a peer reviewer, thank you for that. You inspire, many other institutions who are, we're seeing growth in the accreditation program, which, is totally optional. It's not a required thing. So it is self-motivated museum professionals and teams who decide to pursue this ever evolving standard of excellence, as you said. And I think part of what keeps the program going is that, that inspiration that accredited and reaccredited institutions provide to our field. So thank you for that.
We've had a really great conversation today, I believe, and I just want to make sure that I've given you time to express what you would like to do for the community, museum community, whether it be singular in Conner Prairie and talking to our guests that are on this annual meeting today, or for the larger field. Is there anything that you'd like to close with?
I just want to, reaffirm what I think I said at the beginning about, my gratitude for your leadership, Norman, in our field, and for Conner Prairie's, really exemplary leadership throughout the years, and particularly in this moment of change, to be putting at front and center, reimagining our future, and not kind of trying to go to the comfort of the old normal, but really using this moment of disruption to improve your institution, your community, and I think that impact is felt nationally as well as part of the Alliance. So thank you.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation between Norman and Laura Lott. Laura has joined us here for the live portion of our Q&A for the annual meeting. And, there were a couple major takeaways for me throughout that conversation, one of which was the closing statement about the opportunity to innovate during a moment of disruption. And what a powerful time for all of us to be here, to be thinking about how museums across the country and how communities can continue to adapt, museums particularly as community anchors, to help people be curious, to help them continue to learn. What a powerful moment for all of us to be living in. as we consider the changing fabrics of our community, from the education system to population change, whatever it might be. This is a moment for all of us to continue to adapt and to innovate. And I'm proud to be a part of Conner Prairie and what we're doing here. So I opened up inside of the chat a couple of ways for people to participate in a Q&A section with Laura and with Norman. You can either raise your hand and we will identify that and bring people off of mute, or in addition, you can add questions into the Q&A section. So at this moment, I'm going to say good morning to Laura, Reggie, and Norman. How are the three of you doing?
Good morning. It's so great to be here with all of you for your annual meeting.
Morning, Laura.
Doing well, and Laura, it's good to see you live.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me, Norman.
We'll give folks here just a moment to dust off some of their Zoom cobwebs and start filtering in a few questions that they might have for us.
Well, Laura, we did have a really in-depth conversation, kind of interview, but I do need to apologize. It wasn't on everyone's screen, but apparently while we were talking and I was recording that, I left my cursor in the middle of the screen. So my apologies if you saw a white cursor. That may have been from my recording. So for those of you that are watching today, some of you may have seen a cursor, some of you might not have, but I apologize if that in any way took away from your pleasure of viewing the video this morning.
That's just an example of our continual learning right now, Norman. So 2 years into this thing, we are all still figuring out the technology.
You would think we'd have it down pat now, wouldn't you?
So Laura, I've got a question here for you. You have a great background when it comes to thinking about education and museums, thinking about the intersections of informal and formal education. And so can you talk to us a little bit about, as we think back about 2021, where the education system had to innovate and where you saw really some bright spots for museums to step in as informal out of school time learning spaces for children of all ages?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Of course, my background actually before I came to the museum world was working in several different education organizations, National Geographic among them. And I saw with all of those and was drawn to the museum field because of the power of inspiration in education. Before students or any of us can really learn new things, we need to be, our minds need to be opened to it, right? And we need to be inspired to want to learn. And I think that's one of the roles museums have played really well. And I think it's a shame, actually, that a lot of the way that people think about museums as education institutions is that once a year field trip, maybe for one grade, in a child's school career. What we saw during the pandemic was an elaboration of the museum's role as education institution. So I have a 9-year-old at home. She was home for a year while we were doing virtual school, while I was, my husband and I were still trying to work. And we relied on, a lot of programming, some lesson plans, some resources that museums had developed to, that became available and became more known to us, I think, through during the time of the pandemic via their websites, via Facebook videos, via all sorts of means of museums getting their education out to communities. And by communities, in this case, it wasn't just the community in the local geographic area, but many museums were able to reach, because of the global nature of the internet, we're able to reach people across the country, around the world, and new audiences. My daughter participated in a summer camp from a science museum that was across the country. Would have never, in other times been able to do that, but the pandemic allowed both the museum to reach her and her to experience something, online that she wouldn't have been able to before. And so I think there are that, along with, museums that opened up their spaces for school children to come and do virtual school in a museum, perhaps while their parents were working, to be inspired before and after those virtual lessons with all of the work that and places that our museums have. There are many different ways that museums became more vital to our education community, our education infrastructure the last few years. And I really do hope it doesn't go back anytime soon, because I think there's so much power when we as communities think about museums as part of that infrastructure, part of those assets we can use.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. I've got a couple questions here in the chat that I'm going to relay in, and the first is, how do we take the leadership of Conner Prairie and how do we amplify that? How do we get other museums, as we think of ourselves and as we've seen and much of the acclaim received from AAM and the Smithsonian, that we are a few steps ahead right now of the field as we think about becoming a community anchor that's representative of all of our communities. But what advice, Laura, do you have to us, to our staff that are on this call, to our board members that are on this call? How do we grab the largest microphone possible? And how do we start to help by leading by example, but to show others a pathway that perhaps they can follow much of the steps that Conner Prairie has taken to get to today?
Yeah, well, Conner Prairie and particularly with your CEO, Norman, you all do a great job of this, I have to say. I mean, being part of the national organizations, both the American Association of State and Local History and part of the American Alliance of Museums, and I'm sure others, are ways to influence the whole national field, with what you are doing. And I think importantly, what you're learning too. So all of the work that we're doing, particularly when we're innovating and learning things and implementing things for the first time, we don't always get it right. And being open to sharing those lessons learned, those, gosh, here are the things we didn't quite get right, makes it okay for our colleagues in other parts of the sector to know that that's going to happen, to know that you just work through those struggles, and to be, I think, brave enough to follow Conner Prairie's lead in some areas to try things. So it's always hard to share what we don't do well, but we all know that we don't get everything. When you're trying things for the first time, you don't get it all right the first time. If you do, you're probably not pushing far enough, right? So I think sharing lessons learned and sharing challenges is as important as sharing the great successes that that you and that we all have, and I think you do that well. So thank you for it.
Laura, go ahead, Reggie.
Oh no, that was Andrew. I was just going to say, Laura, what a great way to think about the learning that we teach our earliest learners. Right? It's okay to stumble. It's okay to not get it right on the first try, but you should learn from that. You should share that and you should grow from it. And what a great reminder to lifelong learners, right? As so many of us are on this call, to remember that philosophy and to continue to live by it, that if we only share our successes, people won't know how to emanate some of that without an understanding of the challenges that came right along with it. Norman, did you have something to add before I get to a few of the questions in the Q&A?
No, I was just going to kind of back up what Laura was saying about how we need to try things and realize that there's failure and that we don't always need to come up with the new ideas. One of my first mentors in the museum business 35 plus years ago said, Norman, you can't reinvent the wheel. All you can do is retread the tire, meaning there's no reason, look at what others are doing and make it your own and continually try to improve it. And so I think that's a big part of what museums are continue to do, as we continue to look and learn and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and hopefully continue to push those forward. So I just wanted to back up what Laura was saying.
That's great. So we've got a question here that really comes into the micro level of Conner Prairie and some of the things we're doing when it relates to community partnerships. And so Norman and Reggie, you might take a stab at answering this one. The question is, how can we forge, and Laura, maybe you do have some national examples on this as well, but how can we forge closer ties with our local community, the school systems, local governmental agencies, to really help them see the way in which a Conner Prairie is a fabric of the community, that we can be an anchor site that not only serves guests who might be interested in our mission and what we offer, but also to those who may not know that Conner Prairie can be a place for them. So how do we forge stronger relationships between school systems, governmental agencies to continue to solidify our role here in Central Indiana?
It's a great question.
And I actually think Norman and the team is actually already doing a lot of that, particularly with regards to very strong relationships with both mayors of the towns that touch and annex around Conner Prairie, being Carmel and Fisher. And then also, of course, working with various organizations as it relates to looking for additional funding that is vital to communities with regards to enhancing, community attributes and also community assets. So, Norman, I'll let you expand on that, but I think you guys are already doing that and doing a good job of it.
Well, I think about our site master plan that we created back in 2018. That's really looking at the 1,046 acres of land, the 3.3 miles of river. And before, Conner Prairie had always been, I'm not going to say an obstacle, but to be able to get around us, and realizing that we needed to work closer with the city of Carmel, where our west side property is, and continue to work with the city of Fishers, where we're headquartered, and the fact that we used to be in Noblesville and we're part of Hamilton County. And so we serve so many different communities. And I think what we're doing with our master plan to try to provide that connectivity to the land and to the water and to connect people as an example of how Conner Prairie is beginning to think outward and not just saying, we just want to get people into our program area only. We want people to get outdoors. We want them to engage with these historic resources, which is the land and river, and learn from them. And not only learn from them, but hopefully have an opportunity to get exercise. And if you're exercising your body, you're also having emotional and mental type of healing when it relates to that. And I think that's what an outdoor living history museum or outdoor attraction, whether it be a Conner Prairie, even public parks, that's part of what we're doing. So I think working with our communities and how we plan both our communities and our sites is extremely important. So very, very proud the way that we've been able to work with Fishers and Carmel and others to try to start this process.
Norman, I think that's great. I love the environmental aspect that you brought up as we think about activating the White River at Conner Prairie as we reimagine our future, and the opportunities that presents for us to think about both our sustainability, but also the health and well-being of our residents in an entirely new way, to connect them perhaps to the drinking water that they may not know is what comes out of the faucet when they turn it on, as well as to the incredible habitats that exist on the property here as a way to think about mental health and to think about health and well-being as a whole. So, Laura, I see you brought yourself off mute. What would you like to add?
Norman was just reminding me of one of our champions on Capitol Hill, Congressman Paul Tonko, who's from a very rural upstate New York, who used to talk, or still talks about, the value of museums and building what he called place esteem. Sort of pride and understanding of one's community. And I think what you were just talking about, Norman, really exemplifies that, and is another powerful example of how museums really can be more baked into the local community, the local region.
It's great. Our questions have slowed in the chat. There's one other that asked about what specific examples could we give about how Conner Prairie is working to serve all inside of our community. And I'd love to just give a few examples of that, of going back to enhancement to current program offerings such as the Lenape story, and making sure we're being representative of the native peoples here at Conner Prairie as a unique historic site. I'd also shed light on what we're doing with memory cafes for the aging population as we think about our communities continuing to dwell longer inside of their households. That means that we've got to consider the aging population here in Central Indiana, and how can we serve them through memory cafes, as well as those who may be on the autism spectrum, as we think about our sensory friendly hours and the chance that we have to give a museum experience to those who might need a slightly quieter space with less noise, which is what we heard in that impact video, the fact that there is so much noise and excitement here, but that we have to remember that that's not always for everyone. And so our sensory friendly hours allow us to offer an experience to guests who might need a moment that has a little softer experience inside of it. And so we're proud of that. We're proud of the work that we're doing with the deaf community and our ASL interpreters, making sure that they're available, that history can be heard and learned by everyone, whether that's those who have hearing impairments and those who don't. We're excited about all those offerings. So I'd encourage those who continue to be interested in learning more about that to go on our website. I think you'll find quite a few things about how Conner Prairie is specifically addressing inclusion inside of our community.
Andrew, I
We're
think
about 10.
Go ahead.
No, Norman, please.
No, I was just going to say there's also some comments or questions in chat about, you know, what are some of the other things that we're doing as we look at being inclusive to different communities. And there's one about what is the work that we're doing in equity. And of course, we'll encourage you to look at the information about Promised Land as a Proving Ground, which is an example of how we're beginning to tell the story of African Americans, not just in Indiana, but in America from pre-colonial all the way to the present. And that's just an example of how we're beginning to look at stories of all peoples. And we still have, trust me, we've just scratched the surface. I mean, as we talk about different cultures and the language barriers that are there, we realize that we can do better and will do better as we begin to address that and continue to listen and learn from the communities the best way that they can see themselves in the programming we're doing, because we're at our heart an educational institution. We want to be able to tell the stories of everyone. Our position is that we want people to step into the story, and you have to see yourself here to be able to step into that story. So I just wanted to comment on those because I know there's several comments, Andrew, and I'll encourage people that if you don't get your questions answered today, that you can still reach out to us. You can see many of these things on the website.
That's terrific. And, you know, it leads perfectly, Norman, as we think about the future of Conner Prairie and how will we continue to evolve, right? How will we continue to reimagine our own future and how can we adapt to the ever-changing needs of our community and our constituents? And so the chat has slowed down. Laura, thank you for sharing some of these tremendous links inside of the chat for people to take a look at. For those who have joined us so far, the recording and everything that you've heard up to this point will be shared in an email that'll go out, as well as on our website with our annual impact report, the written version of what it was that we were able to achieve in 2021 as we reimagined our future coming out of COVID-19. So I want to thank Laura for being with us. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. And before we wrap up, let's talk about the future of our museum. Norman, let's take a moment and think about what it is that we have ahead of us. So I'm going to ask Doug to transition us now over to the Prairie Pathways campaign. This is an exciting moment for our museum as we think about reimagining the way people view and use museums as a whole, especially Conner Prairie here in central Indiana. I'm noticing in our participant list for the call today that we have many people who have already joined this incredible effort to reimagine our museum, to set a pathway forward for us to think about new exhibits and experiences that harness curiosity and foster innovation inside some of our youngest guests and begin to tell the whole story. So Norman, let's take just a few minutes before we get to Reggie's closing remarks, and let's give a preview of where we're headed for the future. So I will let Doug advance us to the next slide.
Well, Andrew, during the interview process, the taped interview process, you heard Laura actually mention that AAM, part of the work they do is the Center for the Future of Museums. And they produce about every other year. Sometimes they do it annually, but they produce what's called a Trends Watch. And it really looks at the various trends that are out there. And a few years ago, they did a Trends Watch 2040. That began to look like, not just say these are the trends of how museums are going to evolve, but they actually said, this is what museums will look like in 2040. And I know that this is AAM's graphic and we've used it quite extensively, Andrew. And would you like to just touch on this real quickly before we move on?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think it's exciting to think about the conversation we've had with the AAM and the opportunity to think about aging populations, but also the growth in our youngest learners, to think about the way Conner Prairie that can continue to foster and care for the heritage breeds that we have, the heritage seeds that we care for, and again, to become a part of the fabric of the community. You see here that the future looks at 2040 to include more than 2,000 museum schools, of which Conner Prairie is already there with our HSE partnership, but can continue to expand this, and was relayed thanks to Chris Cook's question inside of the chat, and to think about how we approach sustainability. How can we think about the environment that we live inside of and the responsibility we have for the land that we care for? One of Conner Prairie's greatest assets, our 1,046 acres. Doug, we'll advance ourselves to the next slide here.
So as we think about what we're beginning to reimagine our future, and I mentioned earlier this 1,046 acres of land and the 3.3 miles of river, our site master plan has about 28 projects, some of which we've already accomplished, and we're very proud that we've been able to do that. But the Prairie Pathway campaign is looking at specifically kind of two major projects on the Allisonville Road, or the east side of our property in Fishers. We have a museum experience center, or a welcome center, that was built 40 plus years ago, and it was really seen as a welcome center. It was never built to be a museum exhibit space, and we know that we need to have a year-round presence with exhibits and programs, and we need a space to do that that's a little more conducive. And so that's why this Prairie Pathway campaign is really addressing to create a true museum experience center, so it can be a place that we can bring in exhibits, that we can truly see our partnership as a Smithsonian affiliate, that we can partner with schools and others to do things that are related to specific programming. We want to be a leader, and the previous graphic that we put up from AAM, we want to be a leader in serving a growing and diversified population and aging population. We want to be a leader in sustainability of our natural resources as it relates to the land and the river. We want to do the conservation of our heritage breed animals and the heirloom seeds and plants that we have, and the biomes that we see in this and the natural settings that we have around us. We want to continue to be an anchor for our community, a place where we can have that open dialogue, but we can also serve as a regional asset for how we're telling inclusive stories about everyone, all communities. Remember, our mission statement says that we're going to provide individualized and engaging experiences for everyone, and that's what we want to continue to strive to do through this campaign. And we want to serve local history by globally amplifying our mission, because we're going to be creating starting this year, a digital twin for Conner Prairie. So a lot of the things that we do on site, you'll be able to find digitally, and we want to be a partner for all. And we're going to do that in that campaign. And Doug, if you'll go to the next slide, through this museum experience center, which is really going to tell the story of all of our founding. It started with the land and river. Before anybody was here, the land and the river was here, and we've got to tell that story. And we've got to tell the story of the first people that were here, even prior to the Delaware, the Lenape, and others that were forcefully moved to this area of Indiana. We had people that were here for tens of thousands of years on this land. We've got to tell that story. We also have to tell the story of William Conner and all the complexities that come along with that. And then to honor, once again, our founder, we jokingly did the toothpaste birthday cake this morning for the 137th birthday of Eli Lilly. But he saw in William Conner's story the ability to preserve that part of the story, not just the historic preservation of his home, but to be able to teach history and help people learn in ways that really books can't do it justice. And we want to make sure that people understand that a founder like Eli and Ruth Lilly, what they did by preserving this site has led to Conner Prairie's ability to do these things. We want to make sure we have a building that we can really leverage our relationship with the Smithsonian as affiliate. And we can be a place where not only Smithsonian objects can come in, but Smithsonian exhibits can be here. And we'll literally be a place that people, not only in central Indiana, but throughout the Midwest, can come and have that Smithsonian experience. We have, you heard it in the video earlier, the impact video by Dr. Charlene Fletcher, who's our Director of Curatorial Research and Services, and we have over 27,000 objects in our collection, and very few of them are ever seen. We want to make them more accessible. We want to tell stories. We want to continue to collect to make those collections even more diverse. And we want to make sure that we do exhibits and that we do leadership with youth in ways that continue to be inclusive and involve everyone.
Doug, we'll take ourselves to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about the second priority inside of this campaign, which is to think about the river, to think about the opportunities we have to build awareness of the river's role in our community, to also think about connecting our community, to think of this as one river that serves millions of people inside of not only central Indiana, but all the way down to the Ohio and the Mississippi and the Gulf and our planet's waterways. We have an incredible role to play when it comes to think about stewarding this land and the river and the waterways that run through it. So part of this Prairie Pathways campaign is to activate pathways, to put people next to the river, to activate more than 2.5 miles of trail systems, to bring over 260 acres of our property to life for those who want to enjoy it, and to think about how we can create educational opportunities along the way. Hubs that will focus on the past, the present, and the future of the White River. We're so grateful to those who have already contributed to the success of this campaign so that we can continue to be a northern anchor for the White River Vision Plan in this community. And again, to think about some of the ways we might be able to amplify this across the country, to lead by example, to think about our greatest historical asset as the 1,046 acres. We're excited about activating the Smithsonian here as well. In fact, there are elements of this coming online at the end of this year with Habitat exhibit, where we get to explore the biomes that are both here on our property, but also the biomes that make up this incredible planet that we all share together. And so this is a great opportunity for Conner Prairie and for our community to think about sustainability and connection to the river and to the land that gives us so much life. Doug will advance to the next slide. So where are we in this? This is our preview to well over 100 people on the call today. This is part of our master planning process that started in 2018 and has been completed, identifying nearly 30 projects for the expansion of Conner Prairie, everything from enhancements to our current programming, to think about the Lenape story, to think about the William Conner story, to think about animal encounters in our heritage breeds, but to also push beyond that. To think about what the future of our museum can be for an ever-changing community. We went through quite a bit in the winter and spring of campaign planning and project testing to get to the point where we are today. And since 2019, we've been in an oh so not quiet campaign, raising dollars from those who are closest to us so that we can realize some of these dreams in 2023 and 2024. Doug will advance to the next slide. So where are we today? We're at nearly 80% of our $17 million goal, which will help us bring all of these plans to fruition. We've had 100% board participation, a testament to the commitment of the leadership of this organization to continue to offer new and varying ways for our community to engage. Our Plan Gift program has seen tremendous success. And remember, all of this is built on the fact, as Norman stated, that 3 of our nearly 30 master plan projects have already been completed, that between 2018 and 2020, we went into the space of exploring and renovating and expanding Shenhe Shi, also known as the Chinese house, to include the bluffs. We were able to expand the Prairie House for summer camp, and we were able to expand the offerings that we had for making on the grounds here. Those 3 projects have been the catalyst for where we are today. It's a transformational moment for Conner Prairie, and we're excited about what it's going to bring for the community as a whole. Doug, we'll go to the next slide. We want to thank everybody for their time today, and we're going to invite Reggie here in our last few minutes to close us up as we think about how we take what we've learned and how we apply it moving forward. So our board chairman, Reggie Henderson. And as Reggie gets himself off mute.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate that. And also appreciate everything as it relates to, a wonderful annual meeting and just a host of great information. And, the team is amazing. On behalf of the board, I wanted to, provide kudos to Norman and to the team. They do an amazing job a very experienced and dedicated group of individuals that put their hearts and soul into providing this wonderful asset to the community, and of course also just the passion that it comes through so clearly with regards to the work and support that they have for one another as well as the community. The board is made up of a very diverse group of people from across the community that have brought amazing perspectives to the team, and as a result, it's a lovely collage, if you will, of people and talents from across Hamilton County and across Central Indiana that make up this organization. I'm very proud to be the chair and to work with Norman and the team, and they have our support, and of course we're very, very elated with everything that they have done to leverage the relationships in the community as well as the members of the board. So Norman, with that, I'd like to hand it over to you. And again, on behalf of the board, thank you everyone who participated in this, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Reggie, for giving us the closing comments. And before we close, I just want to say that this type of presentation is not possible without all of our colleagues. I've already mentioned the talented colleagues that have contributed to our program area, but Andrew, I want to thank you and your team for the efforts that they have to put in behind the scenes to organize all of this, to do the videotapes, to put the videos together, to put the annual report together, to make a virtual annual meeting like this go almost seamlessly. I know there's always a few glitches, and for those of you that perhaps were not able to join us at the very beginning, please know, and I think Andrew will probably share it at the end, that all of this will be available as a recorded, as well as materials, including the annual report, will be available later. So once again, we want to thank you for joining us for this virtual annual meeting that really took a look back at 2021 and the impact that we had, but especially beginning to look at how we're reimagining Conner Perry. And we're going to continue to do that. As we said in the video, it's a continuous learning process for Conner Perry. So you can count on us, and Reggie, you've kind of said this, whether it's staff or board or volunteers or our many supporters, I think we will always continue to move forward and look at new ways to make Conner Perry that exemplar museum that Laura Lott mentioned in her keynote address. So Andrew, do you have any parting things about what people will find after this meeting?
Yeah, we just want to thank everybody again for joining us. All of this will be posted online come Monday as we download the recordings and make sure that everything is as we'd like it to be. You'll also find our annual impact report online. All that can be found on Conner Prairie's website. Again, thank you to the community who allows us to deliver our mission each and every day, and to all the incredible staff and volunteers who bring it to life. Without anything else left on the table, and with only 3 minutes over for an annual meeting, which is pretty remarkable, I think we'll say thank you and wish everybody an incredible weekend. And we look forward to seeing you on the grounds here, hopefully this summer, or at next year's live annual meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.